chest of drawers and a mirror that lies. Mirror that lies, a mirror that lies. That couldn't be me in the gorilla disguise.
Well, the family lived in Guanajuato for years when Mother and Aunt Edith and Auntie Flo and Uncle Louie were all growing up, was the house on the Calle del Pardo. Now, the property that Grandfather acquired there for the church had been an old silver reduction works, and they lived in what had been the manager's house, which was a house up by the street, and it had stone walls 4 feet thick. Then down in the back was where the reduction works with the patio process had been, by the river wall, and the Guanajuato River ran behind. Then there was more property down beyond where he had the girls' school, and then later he built a hospital between the house and the girls' school, and had the nurses' training school there. But the house where they lived, I visited when we were there in the 1930s. There were still people living in the house, and we went to visit them, and then I have pictures of the house. And that's the house where in the flood of 1906, when the river was so high, it overflowed its banks and was running through downtown Guanajuato, which is in the riverbed up in the mountains there. And the river was running down the Calle del Pardo in front of the house. The water was up over the high-walled garden, right up to the front windows of the house. And the mozo, the manservant, saw that you could see grand pianos and billiard tables going by the house, going down the street on the river. And the mozo saw something that he liked out there going by, and he leaned out to get it, and he was swept away, and he was never seen again. But that was all pretty impressive. And that's where it was, there in the Calle del Pardo, where the river was flowing through with the grand pianos and the billiard tables. That's where Pancho Villa had my grandparents stood up to shoot them on 2 occasions. And that's the street that's in the painting that we have of Guanajuato, which I have here in my hallway. But that house has been torn down, and the hospital has been torn down, but interestingly enough, they have a hospital there on that spot, which is sort of like the cat came back. They got rid of all traces of Grandfather in his hospital, but they built another hospital on the spot, which I suppose is the ultimate vengeance. But after my grandmother died and Grandfather retired, he decided that he always wanted to live downtown. And he bought this big spooky old house on the Plaza de la Paz downtown in front of the Parroquia Church. And that's where Mother and I used to spend summers. My step-grandmother, Auntie Mary, was there. Grandfather died when I was 8 years old. But we'd go down and spend summers there, and then later I spent summers there alone. And it was quite wonderful. It was 3 stories up and some other sort of rambled back into the block. When you look at the picture, the front of it doesn't look very large. It has the shop, Grandfather's stationer's shop, and the saguan, the entrance door that goes back into the patio on the ground floor. And up over that, there are the 2 high windows with balconies, and etched glass French doors going into the drawing room, which looks quite small, but it was a large room. And then on top of that is another room, which was the 3rd floor sitting room, and behind that were the bedroom and bath where Mother and I used to stay in the summer. Well, the house sort of worked its way back into the block and spread out, so it was bigger than what showed on the street. And you went into the patio and went up the stairs to the 2nd floor, which was the main floor of the house, and the drawing room was on the front with Grandfather's library and another little room behind that, and then either 1 or 2, I don't remember, bedrooms looking out onto the patio. And then at the back of that floor was the big master bedroom, and what had been the ante bedroom of that, and Grandfather had divided it in half and put in a bathroom with plumbing, and that was really quite splendid on that floor. And then beyond that, also off the little side hall, was the big dining room, and he had put in a fireplace in the drawing room and also in the dining room, because the Spaniards weren't big on fireplaces. They felt it polluted the house to have a fire in there. And then the kitchen was out behind that, off the kitchen patio. And from the little hallway outside the dining room, there was a very steep, tiny, winding stairway which went up to the 3rd floor, which was where Mother and I used to stay in the summer. And that was kind of amazing, because it had what had probably originally been the entrance hall with all the lovely tile and stained glass windows, which led into the bedroom, and then with the sitting room up steps looking out over the plaza beyond that, in front of the house. Well, what had been the entrance hall had been made into the bathroom. So it doubled in brass as the entrance hall and the bathroom, which was a rather unusual combination, with a great big tub up on claw feet and all of that. But I'll never forget the bathroom, which doubled in brass as the entrance hall. And I can remember when staying there when I was a child, there were these other spooky rooms down below. On the main floor, back behind the store, there was a big room where Grandfather had his printing press. He used to publish a lot of stuff. And then there were these other kind of mysterious rooms, and you went down a hall and down some stairs. The house was kind of on a hill, so there were, what was on the ground floor when you walked in was kind of on the 2nd floor on the back of the house, looking out toward the back. And there were these other kind of mysterious rooms. But there were some stairs that went down, and they went down for a ways, and they were cut off. They had a wooden partition that cut them off. Well, Anita, the portera, the woman who kept the door, had her little grandson, Raimundo, used to come over after school, and he'd be there, and we used to play together, and Raimundo and I used to go down and look at that, and there was a little space, about just enough to squeeze under this wooden partition where the steps were. And I'd get flashlights, and we'd go down there and look underneath. And where did these stairs go that went down from the bottom of the house and went no place? Well, I figured out later it was probably a way to escape from the house in case of emergency, and it probably came out on this covered walkway that went through a couple of doors down, went through the back street. That's probably where it would have led. I don't know where else it could have gone. But Raimundo and I used to dare each other to crawl under that space on the other side, and neither of us ever did, but it was just fascinating to have the spooky stairs going down to no place from the bottom of the house. I do remember that very well. I think I used to have nightmares about those stairs and what might come up and crawl underneath the partition. So that was the spooky old house on the plaza. And the house is still there. I understand that and the 2 houses next to it have been gutted, and they left up the facades and made a hotel inside the 3 of them, but that it still looks the same on the street. Now, I haven't been down there, so I don't know if this is really the case. But when you look at the pictures, it's still there, and the Canastillo de Flores, the Spanish grocery store owned by the Oyunguren family, is 2 doors down the hill toward Pardo. And I just got my hands on the movie Bugambilia with Dolores del Rio, which was made, in 1946 or something like that. And it's supposed to be the Gone with the Wind of Mexico. And that was actually shot in Guanajuato. My family took me to see it when it came out, but I didn't understand enough Spanish to be able to follow it, but I can now. And it's this wonderful story which takes place around the time of the Civil War, so Maximilian and Carlota were probably in all their glory in Mexico City at the time. And it shows Guanajuato in all its glory, with all the crystal chandeliers and the grand pianos and the balls and the caballeros riding up on horseback and the whole thing. It's perfectly splendid. And I'm just thrilled to pieces to have that little piece of historical flashback in my hands. So Guanajuato was always a fascinating and wonderful place, and hoping to see it again in a couple of years. Well, Mother's family had When they went to Mexico in 1885, Aunt Edith was a babe in arms, and they settled in Pachuca, up north of Mexico City. And Mother was born in Pachuca in 87. And they were down in Puebla for a couple of years. And Grandfather went back to the States and finished his medical degree. And then he decided to settle in Guanajuato, which he did, and he established a hospital there, and he had the first nurses training school in Mexico. In fact, the Indian girls came down from the mountains, and they had to teach them Spanish before they could teach them nursing, because they spoke the local Indian dialects. And my grandfather was very buddy-buddy with Dr. Kellogg of Battle Creek, the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and they exchanged techniques back and forth. Well, my grandfather was the best doctor in Mexico at that point, and people came to him from all over the country. And so, since he was certainly the only good doctor in town and the best doctor in Mexico, he sort of looked after everyone, which included the nuns and the whores, and in one case the elephant and the circus. One year when the circus came to town, the elephant had a terrible toothache, and it was really quite miserable. And the owner of the circus went to my grandfather and said, "My elephant is just in a terrible state. Will you please come and see if you can do anything for my elephant?" So Grandfather made a house call to the elephant in the circus, and he pulled her tooth, which took away her toothache, and she was really quite pleased about that. And every year thereafter, when the circus came to town, the circus owner always sent Grandfather free passes, and he went to visit his patient, the elephant. And the amazing thing is that she always recognized him, and she always curtsied to him, because she remembered the nice man who fixed her toothache. So, as we always said, Grandfather looked after everyone, the nuns and the horse and the elephant in the circus. My grandfather counted among his patients in Guanajuato, in addition to everybody else, the nuns and the whores, and on occasion the elephant in the circus. And the fanciest lady of the evening in Guanajuato was Prajedes, and she had a very grand establishment and counted among her patrons all the classiest men in town. And she was one of Grandfather's patients, and one day Prajedes died. And she named my grandfather as her executor, which was not exactly something he would have chosen, but he considered he must come through with a duty. So he was presiding over this grand auction where they were auctioning off all of her effects. And when it came down to auctioning off her brass bedstead, it was really amazing, because they had several ex-governors and major attorneys, and some of the clergy, among others, were all bidding on this brass bedstead with tears in their eyes. I guess they had some pretty wonderful memories of her. But one thing which came down to me from this was Prajedes' crucifix, which I have always cherished, and I keep it on my bedside table, and I figure if it was good for her, it's probably good for me. And there are times in the dead of night, if the goblins are chasing me around the bedpost, that I can reach out for Prajedes' crucifix, and it's been a great comfort to me over the years. When Mother and Aunt Edith were little kids, I don't know, maybe Mother was 8 and Aunt Edith was 10 or something, so that sounds about right. They were playing with some other children, I don't remember who those were, in the orchard at the house in Pardo, the orchard down by the river. Now, the orchard was where the reduction works had been, and in the days of the silver reduction works, it was when they were using the patio process, and the mules would go around in a circle they were tied to a thing in the middle, and they went round and round, and they would put the silver ore on the flagstones there with this mud that had mercury in it, and the mules' hoofs would sort of help the mercury get the silver out of the ore. And the mercury would kill the mules and the men that drove them in a couple of years, but it paid very well and it left their families well fixed, and there were always men who were willing to take that job to provide for their families. Well, when grandfather acquired the property for the mission, it was after the cyanide process had come in and they were no longer using the patio process with the mercury, so this reduction works was no longer active. And he had all the flagstones taken up, and enough mercury came out from the cracks and all that he sold the mercury, and it helped provide the money to build the hospital. But he took the ground that they had used for the patio process and planted it as an orchard. Well, this was the time that they were building the hospital, or they were building an addition on the hospital. So they had all the building materials down there at the edge of the orchard with the stacks of adobe blocks and, you know, stone and wood and whatever they were using for building were all stacked up down there. Well, grandmother had a couple of bake ovens down there. There was no oven in the kitchen, but when she wanted to bake, she had the manservant fire up one or two of these ovens that were sort of like beehives down in the orchard. And she could tell by putting her hand in when the temperature was right. They'd rake out the coals and then you put it. She could bake angel food cakes in those ovens. It was amazing. But they were quite large, and they were so large that you could actually crawl in the hole when the oven was not heated up. Well, one day Mother and Aunt Edith and these other couple of little kids were down there playing around and playing hide and seek in the orchard and in and out among the building materials and behind the big beehive ovens and all that sort of thing. And it was getting dusk. And the other children went back up to the house and they said to Aunt Edith, "Oh, come on." They said, "We'd better go because the servants say that, you know, if we stay out after dusk, the devil will come after us." And well, Aunt Edith was very brave and she wasn't afraid of the devil. And the other children went on back up to the house and up the back steps. And she was still down there. And as she went by one of the ovens, the devil crawled out of the oven through the rounded hole where you put the cakes in and all. And he had a long red tail. He had horns on his head. He was all red. And he had this long tail. And there was a pitchfork on the end of it. And he started chasing her up and down around the piles of lumber, swishing his tail like a lariat, trying to throw his pitchfork at her. She swore this to her dying day, and she ran up and down, and finally she got far enough that she could make a break for it and run up the house and go up the back stairs and be safe. But until her dying day, she swore that the devil came out of one of grandmother's ovens, all turned out in red, and chased her up and down in the orchard. When the family was living in Guanajuato, and Mother and Aunt Edith were little girls, maybe about 6 and 8 years old, which would have been in the early 1890s. Grandfather was going down to Mexico City on business one time, and really for such a starchy, pompous old coot, he was really a very good father, and he would take the little girls with him on trips, and he knew how to do their hair. They'd go in the Pullman car, and he'd have a candle and a brush, and he would brush their hair around the candle and pull it down to make the corkscrew curls that the little girls wore in those days. And so he'd taken the 2 little girls down to Mexico City, and he had business with the president, Porfirio Diaz, out at Chapultepec Castle, which is up on top of the hill in Chapultepec Park in Mexico City, out at the end of the Paseo de la Reforma. And so they showed up at the entrance of the palace. Grandfather and his 2 little girls with the long blonde curls and the big silk bows in their hair and the little white ruffly dresses. And the servant said, "Oh, El Presidente is having a party in the garden. Won't you come in?" So they took them into the garden, and there was a garden party in full swing. And Porfirio Diaz came over and greeted my grandfather, And he said, "Ah, Señor Doctor," he said, "how splendid of you to bring your two little golden angels today to grace our garden party." And he patted Mother and Aunt Edith on their little golden heads with their long golden curls. So I've always had sort of a warm feeling in my heart for Porfirio Diaz. He's been bad-mouthed a lot, but he really did a great deal of good for Mexico over the years. During the 1910-1920s revolution in Mexico, Pancho Villa came in and took Guanajuato on 2 different occasions. The first time he came in, he and his men came riding up from the Bahia, the Central Valley, up from Silao. And of course, when you come in from the bottom of Guanajuato, you come up by the Parque del Cantador and up the Calle del Pardo, which is where Grandfather's hospital and the house were. So they get up that far, and Pancho Villa says to his men, "Come on, let's shoot some Americans." Well, most of the Americans had left town by then, but somebody said, "There's an American doctor over there." He said, "Fine, bring him out, we'll shoot him." So he had Grandfather stood up in the middle of the Calle del Pardo, out in front of the hospital. At this point, my grandmother, Sarah, from Morristown, New Jersey, who was a woman of conviction and very devoted to her husband, wearing her white tucked shirtwaist with the lace and the long sleeves and all, and the long black skirt, and her hair back in a knot. And she went out and stood by my grandfather and said to Pancho Villa, "Mi general," because that's how you address someone who thought he was a general and no one had yet proven to him that he was not. She said, "Mi general, if you are going to shoot the doctor, would you be so good as to shoot me also, because we always go everywhere together?" Which so unnerved Pancho Villa that he dropped the whole project and went galloping off uptown with his men. Well, the next time he took Guanajuato, he was feeling less squeamish, and they were coming up again from the Bahia, past the Parque del Cantador, and going up the Calle del Pardo toward town. He remembers the American doctor. And he says to his men, "Oh," he said, "that American doctor and his wife," he said, "we didn't shoot them the last time we were in town. Let's shoot them now." So they brought out my grandfather and my grandmother and stood them up in the middle of the street. They're getting all ready to shoot them, and he's got his men all lined up, taking aim at them and getting ready to fire. And just then his avant-garde came galloping down from the top end of the city, up by the dam at the top of town, to say that the Federales, the federal troops, were coming down from the little town of Dolores Hidalgo up in the mountains. So Pancho Villa dropped the whole project of shooting my grandparents and went galloping off to fight the Federales. So that is how my grandparents happened to be stood up to be shot twice by Pancho Villa and never actually were. My grandmother died a few years later at the age of 64 of cirrhosis of the liver, never having had a drop to drink in her life. She got it from the stress of living through the revolution, which, as you can imagine, was considerable.
Okay.
Are we off?
We're on.
All right. Well, this is going to be the story about our Niño de Atocha from Guanajuato. And the story begins on the 16th of September in 1810 with the Battle of Guanajuato, which was the beginning of the revolution against Spain. And the priest Hidalgo brought down a group of Indians from the little town of Dolores up in the mountains above Guanajuato. And they marched on the Spanish in Guanajuato, demanding independence. And the Spanish had just finished building Granaditas, which is this beautiful 3-story stone granary in the middle of downtown Guanajuato. And they were all in there using it as a fortress, up on the top of Granaditas with guns shooting down at the revolutionaries. And the revolutionaries couldn't get anywhere until one of them, who was called El Pipila, which means the little turkey cock, put a big flagstone on his back and took a lighted torch and went up and set fire to the carved double doors of the granary. And when the doors burned down, the revolutionaries all poured inside. So the Battle of Guanajuato took place inside the building, and much of it on the grand stairway in the patio. And when I was a child, Mother took me there to see it in the 1930s. And you could still see the bloody handprints all turned brown on the white wall of the grand stairway. But since then, they let the American tourists in, and they all said, "Ew," so they painted out the bloody hand marks from the Battle of Guanajuato, and that really does seem like a shame. Well, one of the people who was involved, the Spaniards who was involved in the Battle of Guanajuato, was Mr. Arizmendi, the head of the Arizmendi family. And he was a very important person in Guanajuato at the time. And he was grievously wounded in the battle. And his family went to their parish church and made a vow that if he were to be restored to health, they would commission a Niño de Atocha to be made by a local saint maker. And the Niño would spend the year sitting on the hand of the Blessed Virgin Mary in their parish church on a spike in her palm. He's got a little hole in the bottom that fits right in the spike. But that at Christmas time, he would go to their home to be their Niño Dios in the posadas. Well, Papa Arizmendi did indeed recover, and as closely as we could figure, around 1817 or so, they commissioned a Niño de Atocha to be made by a local saint maker. And when my mother and Aunt Edith were little girls in Guanajuato, around the turn of the next century, Chucha Arizmendi, Maria de Jesus Arizmendi, Chucha, was their friend, and so they were invited to the family posadas at the big Arizmendi home on the Calle de los Positos. And they had the Niño de Atocha home for the holidays with their family. And in the posadas, he was carried around from doors. They went around to the different doors inside the house in the patio, looking, as though they were inns asking for shelter. And they carried the baby Jesus on a large silver tray surrounded by French creams. And you kissed his little toe in reverence and took a French cream in honor of the occasion. Well, when the 1910-1920s revolutions came, and things got pretty bad in Guanajuato, Mother had left for the States in 1914, and around 1915 or so, Chucha came to the door of the family home on Pardo carrying a large box. And she asked for Aunt Edith, and so Aunt Edith came into the parlor and met with her, and the big box. And Chucha said, Edith, she said, things are getting really bad in Guanajuato, and all the foreigners are leaving. And she said, one of these days, you will be going to the States. And she said, I'm giving you our baby Jesus to take with you when you go to the States. And Aunt Edith said, why, Chucha, I couldn't possibly accept such a gift. And Chucha said, well, she said, you must, because he's not safe here. The Cristeros are looting and pillaging the churches. And she said, what is more, I've already done the penance for giving him to you. She said, the only conditions are that he must always be treated with respect as the baby Jesus, never referred to as it or a doll. And so Aunt Edith agreed, and she brought him to the States. Well, Aunt Edith taught Spanish in college for 30 years. And every year at Christmas time, she brought out the baby Jesus and showed him to her classes and told him his story. And later days, well, when we bought the house in Hillsborough in '71, Mother sent up the grand piano for the drawing room, and Aunt Edith sent up baby Jesus and said, he's your responsibility now. So every year we had a party for the baby Jesus at Christmas time, and he was on top of the grand piano in the drawing room, surrounded by Sam's best plastic pine boughs on a red velvet throw, and everyone came to a party and heard his story, and everybody had a lovely time. And after I was living in the apartment on Elm Street, we still had the baby Jesus party at Christmas time, and he held court and received all his guests. Now, he's wearing all of his original clothes with the exception of his booties. We think these are from around probably the 1890s or thereabouts. And some nice woman in Guanajuato decided that his dear little feet were cold. He's lost a little toe there. It was supposed to be in his box, but it never turned up. And she decided that his little feet were cold, and so she crocheted booties for him. So he's had those for over 100 years. But everything else is original. This was the diaper that the Mexican babies wore, except that his has beautiful Mexican drawn work on it. And then over that is his little woolen skirt in the Mexican colors, red, white, and green. And then he has his little white shirt that a baby would have worn. And his little head covering, which you see how lovely his head is when he pulls it down. And so it's all original with the exception of the booties. We have a few moth holes in the skirt, but as I say to everyone, and he's lost a couple of fingers, a couple of pointers, and he's lost one big toe. But as I say to everyone, if after 200 years you look this good, you'll be very fortunate. So that's the story of our baby Jesus. For several years, I've been trying to find a way to get him back to the right church, to wherever in Guanajuato his mother is sitting with her hand outstretched and a spike in her palm, waiting for him to come back. Now, I've tried all sorts of contacts in Guanajuato. Somebody said that the church had been torn down. Now, it's possible that it may have been torn down when they built the new buildings for the University of Guanajuato on Pocitos. But whether it's still in the original church or it has been torn down, someone should be able to locate the statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, I have a friend who has a house in Guanajuato who would be happy to take him down and turn him over to the right authorities. But I don't want to turn him over to just anyone and have him end up in an antique shop, because that's not what I'm here for. Unless I can find the way to get him back, I'm going to protect him, and then my son Robin can worry about it when I'm no longer here. It'll be his problem. So it's an ongoing effort. Every now and then I think there's a flicker of hope for establishing a contact. But if I can find someone who is responsible, right now I'm trying to maybe make contact with the American consul, who is no longer in Guanajuato. He's now in San Miguel de Allende, but I need to write to him. If I could make contact with the right priest at the top of the hierarchy in the parroquia church, he would know how to look up in the records and find out which church was the parish church of the Arismendi family, and that would track down, is it still standing, or did the Blessed Virgin Mary with the extended hand go from there to another church, or where is she now? And hopefully we can get a line on this and find out some way to get him returned so that my friend could take him down to Guanajuato and turn him over to the proper authorities. And in the meantime, I guess he's my responsibility and subsequently Robin's, so there you are.
What about your trip to Mexico next summer? Do you think maybe you could find out by then and be close enough to wherever that was?
Well, what I'm hoping is, it's 2 years from now.
Oh.
So I've got time, and I'm going to try contacting the American consul in San Miguel de Allende to see if he can put me in touch with someone high up at the parroquia church on the Plaza de la Paz. And then if I can communicate with him, if we can establish this properly, then I hopefully could be able to talk to somebody when we're in Guanajuato 2 years from now. Who knows? It might work.
You should be the one to return them. Really, not that your friend won't.
Well, it depends on the timing.
Yeah.
If I can find out where he's going and be prepared to take him down, by the time we go in 2 years, I could take him down. But if I'm still looking, I don't want to take him down and then have to bring him back and try to get him out of Mexico and run into all kinds of trouble trying to remove a piece of history from Mexico, although he's been in my family for almost 100 years in protective custody. So I really don't want to take him down unless I'm sure that I've got the right contact to hand him over to.
Right. So pretty. Okay.
Well, there's a wonderful story about these dragon chairs. I met them for the first time when I was 5 years old when we went to Mexico City for the winter in 1936. And we went through Guanajuato and went down on the train as far as Silao and had to get off at 2 o'clock in the morning and stay overnight in a little hotel in Silao and go up to Guanajuato in the morning on the train on the sideline up in the mountains. And it was pouring rain, and we come into the funky old train station in the pouring rain, and grandfather's there with a hired car to meet us, and we go down to the spooky old house on the Plaza de la Paz, and we were upstairs in the drawing room, and it was dark and gloomy and rainy outside, and it's all this old Victorian furniture, and there are these two dragon chairs. And they really look a lot scarier without the nice orange silk cushions. And it took me quite a while to get up the courage to go up and pat one of the dragon chairs on the nose, but I did. And I've always been really very fond of the dragon chairs, and when I would spend summers down there, the dragon chair was there in the drawing room, and it was always part of the family. Well, the story about the dragon chairs goes back to the Manila galleons, because when Mexico was under Spain until the Revolution of 1810, the Manila galleons came over from China every year loaded with the riches of the Orient. And the Manila galleon came once a year into Acapulco. And all of this wonderful stuff was downloaded and loaded on the backs of mules on mule trains and carried up over the mountains across Mexico to Veracruz, where it was loaded on ships and shipped on to Spain. Now, nothing was supposed to be diverted in transit. But the wealthy families, colonial families in Mexico, always knew when the Manila galleon was coming in. And they would send their agent down to Acapulco to grease the right palms and bring back something for their Chinese collection. And it was very fashionable in those wealthy households to have a Chinese room. And they had Chinese furniture and Chinese rugs on the floor and Chinese hangings on the wall and Chinese porcelain, and they had Chinese silken robes. And they'd put on their Chinese silken robes and sit on their Chinese chairs and drink China tea out of their Chinese porcelain cups and think what they hoped were Chinese thoughts, but probably were not. And this was all really quite the thing. They didn't have television in those days. Well, when the 1920s revolution with Pancho Villa and all had come and gone, the wealthy families from the outlying areas in the colonial cities like Guanajuato were pretty much picking up and moving to Mexico City to be safe because it had been pretty hairy in the provinces. And so as they moved, they were breaking up their households and selling up all the funky stuff they had in the country before they went into town and bought all their nice modernistic furniture of the era, which was really pretty scary, but that's another story. And at that time they were breaking up a big house across the street from my grandfather's house on the, well, later my grandfather's house on the Plaza de la Paz. He was still living down at Pardo at the time. But my Aunt Edith and Aunt Flora bought this pair of dragon chairs for my grandmother for a present. And so that's how they got into the family. And I have pictures of the parlor at the house in Pardo with the dragon chairs in the picture. So when my step-grandmother died, about 1966, Auntie Mary, it was always said that I was to have my grandmother Sarah's square grand piano from the drawing room in Guanajuato. That had been a wedding present to my grandparents from their best man. And the whole family had learned to play on it, and I'd played it when I was young. Well, at that point, we had Auntie Flo's lovely spinet in the house in Burlingame, and we were getting ready to move into the big house, and knew Mother's grand piano was coming. And I really didn't need one more grand piano right then, and it wasn't too easy to get it up. So we wrote back and said, thank you very much, but I'll pass on the grand piano. So they wrote back, and they said, well, in that case, would you like to have the dragon chairs? And I said, yes. Mm-hmm. And so Mother and Aunt Edith arranged for all the paperwork and paid, and they got somebody to come in from Leon, 40 miles away, and wrap them in newspaper and tie them in hempen cord and build a great big heavy crate around them and ship them up by rail. And I'd forgotten all about the whole thing. And one day we had a telephone call from the train station in Burlingame. And they said, we've got a very large wooden crate here for you. I thought, good heavens, the dragon chair. So Hugh went down with the old Ford station wagon and wrestled this big crate into the back and brought it up, and was so well put together it took him hours to get enough of the crate undone that we could get in there and cut some of the hemp and get the newspaper off and see one of the dragon's heads. And it was just so exciting. Mm-hmm. So we had the two dragon chairs there in the living room in Burlingame on Hoover Avenue, and then when we moved to the big house, we had them in the drawing room in Hillsborough. And I had the two of them in my flat for 20 years on Elm Street in San Mateo. Now I have one of them up here in Arcata. I don't have room for two. Robin's got the other one down at the ranch, but I have one to keep me company, and I know where the other one is. So that's the story of our dragon chairs from Guanajuato, which came originally from China by way of the Manila Galleon. Mother and Aunt Edith graduated from Ohio Wesleyan University in Delaware, Ohio in 1909. And they went back to Mexico, and Mother was working in the office keeping the books at Grandfather's hospital. Then, of course, in 1910 came the revolution, and things were getting nastier and nastier. And by 1914, it was really getting pretty hairy, and Mother decided she was going to leave. So Mother made it down to Mexico City, and she met up with somebody else, some other woman that they knew down there. And the two of them took the train down to Veracruz. Well, the train from Mexico City to Veracruz goes through tunnels, and it goes over trestles. And they've been blowing up tunnels and trestles and things like that. And so all the way, every time they went into a tunnel, they expected it to be blown up. Every time the train went over a trestle, they expected it to be blown up, so they were sort of holding their breath. Well, they got down to within about 10 or 15 miles of Veracruz, and the American Marines had landed, and they'd taken Veracruz, and the train couldn't go into Veracruz. So they had to run the train back, all the way back up to Mexico City, and there they were. So Mother hid out with about 20 other Americans in sort of a basement there in Mexico City for about 3 weeks until they had another chance to get out, and they found that there was an American gunboat coming into Tampico up north of Veracruz. And so somehow or other they managed to get up to Tampico, and they got on the American gunboat up to Corpus Christi, and they slept on the deck of the American gunboat, and they ate Navy beans, and Mother said Navy beans never tasted so good. And she felt she was on American soil, and she never really lived in Mexico again after that, but it was quite a grand departure. Then Grandfather and Grandmother finally had to get out around 1917. They were out for 2 or 3 years because the revolution was really hot before they could go back. But at one point, Uncle Louis was a colonel on the cavalry on Obregon's presidential staff, And he was galloping all over northern Mexico with his men after Pancho Villa, so that was all pretty exciting. No wonder grandmother died of cirrhosis of the liver, which she got from the stress of the revolution. It must have been pretty wild. One night in the house on Pardo, during the revolution, there was a knocking at the door, and the servant went to the door, and here was a Mexican man with the sombrero and the crossed cartridge belts and the two pistols and the sword and the whole thing standing there at the door. She was terrified. And this man said he wanted to speak to Senora Salmans. Well, my grandmother was standing within reach, and she recognized him. And it was this man who had been one of the little boys in her Sunday school class when he was little. And she said, Juanito, what are you doing here? Well, he said, we're in Guanajuato right now. And he said, we're going on to a battle. But he said, I just didn't want to leave town without coming to have a few words with you. Could we sit down and chat? Well, Grandmother Sarah said, I'm really not sure that I could chat with anybody who was wearing cartridge belts and two pistols and a sword. And he took off his cartridge belts and the two pistols and the sword, and he put them all down on top of the square piano, and they sat down probably on the dragon chairs in the drawing room, and they had a nice chat. And he said, Senora, I just wanted to let you know how highly I regard you and what a great influence you have been in my life. And so they hugged, and he said, well, I really must be going on now. And he put on the cross cartridge belt and the two pistols and strapped on the sword and took his sombrero, and off he went into the night, got halfway down the block in Pardo and was shot dead. And that's the way it was during the revolution. And there's a verse about Guanajuato and all of this in La Cucaracha, where it goes into the part about Ya se van los federales por la presa de Esperanza, porque les tuvieron miedo a las tropas de Carranza. La cucaracha ya no quiere caminar, porque no tiene, porque le falta marihuana que chupar.